Every city has a version of itself that never made it into the tourist brochure, the version underground, sealed off, forgotten, or just quietly ignored by everyone walking past it every day. Some of these spaces were abandoned mid-construction. Some were closed on purpose and never reopened. A couple are still fully operational right now, doing exactly the job they were built for, just somewhere nobody thinks to look. These 10 tunnels are still down there right now. So today, we're counting down 10 secret tunnels hidden under American cities you've never heard of. Number 10, the Chicago Pedway, Illinois. Most people who've spent a Chicago winter underground didn't plan it that way. They just followed the signs. The Chicago Pedway is a roughly 5-mile network of underground and enclosed walkways connecting more than 50 buildings across the loop, including train stations, office towers, hotels, and shopping concourses, all stitched together specifically so downtown workers could avoid the brutal lake-effect wind for as much of their commute as possible. On the coldest days of January, it's genuinely possible to travel from a commuter train platform to an office desk several blocks away without ever stepping outside once, passing dry cleaners, coffee shops, and the occasional shoe shine stand tucked along the way. Businesses that have quietly built entire operations around underground foot traffic rather than street-level visibility. Construction started piece by piece in the 1950s, with the first tunnel connecting the Red Line's Washington Station to nearby buildings. And it grew opportunistically over the following decades as individual developers agreed to link their basements into the growing maze rather than through any single unified master plan drawn up all at once. That piecemeal history is exactly why the Pedway has a reputation, even among longtime Chicagoans, for being genuinely disorienting, poorly marked in stretches, prone to dead ends where a building owner simply decided decades later to seal off their section, and confusing enough that the city eventually had to install a dedicated wayfinding system with color-coded signage just to keep people from getting turned around under their own downtown. It's not glamorous, and it's definitely not secret in the conspiracy theory sense, but most visitors to Chicago ride the L, eat the deep dish, and never once realize there's a whole second city running beneath their feet, mostly used by people just trying to stay dry. Number 9, the Rochester Subway Tunnel, New York. When the Erie Canal was rerouted around downtown Rochester in 1918, the city looked at the newly abandoned canal bed and saw an opportunity: a ready-made trench for a rapid transit line, sparing planners the enormous expense of digging one from scratch. The Rochester Industrial and Rapid Transit Railway, known simply as the Rochester Subway, opened for passenger service on December 1, 1927, running along roughly 7 miles of the old canal route, with a 2-mile stretch running through downtown actually enclosed as a genuine underground tunnel beneath Broad Street. Built using a cut-and-cover method that let the street simply be constructed on top once the tunnel below was finished. The subway never quite escaped the fate of most mid-century American transit lines: declining ridership, a growing love affair with the automobile, and expressway construction that eventually swallowed large chunks of its route, with the eastern leg getting paved over entirely to make way for Interstate 490. Passenger service ended on June 30, 1956, and by 1976, the city had filled in most of the remaining open sections entirely, citing the cost of maintaining aging bridges along the route. What's left today is the Broad Street Tunnel itself, a stretch that briefly kept running freight deliveries to the local newspaper's printing plant before going fully dark, and which now functions mostly as an ever-changing gallery for local graffiti artists and a place local officials periodically float, turning into a bike path or art venue without ever quite following through on either idea. The last surviving passenger car from the system, simply labeled car number 60, now sits on permanent display at the Rochester and Genesee Valley Railroad Museum, the closest thing the subway has to a proper memorial. Visitors willing to peer through the arched windows of the Broad Street Bridge can still catch a glimpse of the abandoned platform below, a strange little architectural time capsule hiding in plain sight beneath one of downtown Rochester's busiest crossings. Number 8, the United States Capitol Tunnels, Washington, D.C. Beneath the dome that shows up on every civics textbook cover sits a genuinely elaborate underground transit system built for a remarkably mundane reason: Washington's weather. The first tunnel, connecting the Russell Senate Office building to the Capitol, opened in 1909. Built specifically so senators wouldn't have to walk outside in the rain, and it originally ran on custom Studebaker electric cars, before eventually being upgraded to monorails and, later, automated subway cars. A 1907 Washington Post article laid out the reasoning about as plainly as government planning documents ever get. The tunnels existed so that it will not be necessary for the senators and representatives to go out into the open at all in order to reach offices from the Capitol, or vice versa. The system has grown considerably since, now linking all three Senate office buildings and the Rayburn House office building to the Capitol through a mix of small, open-air trams and pedestrian tunnels, one of which, the Cannon Tunnel, has evolved into something closer to an underground strip mall, complete with a post office, a credit union, and a cafeteria, its walls decorated with student artwork sent in from across the country. It hasn't always been purely mundane, either. In 1947, Senator John W. Bricker survived being shot at inside the Capitol subway tunnel by a former Capitol police officer, and the tunnels themselves became a genuine security choke point during the January 6, 2021 riot, when lawmakers and staff were evacuated through the same underground passages originally built just to keep senators dry, a use nobody involved in the 1909 planning meetings could have possibly anticipated. Today, the system carries a steady stream of lawmakers rushing to catch votes, with Senate Historical Office Associate Historian Daniel Holt explaining the underlying logic simply. Most senators avail themselves of the subway simply because it's convenient. The Capitol complex doesn't build up, it builds out. Public tourists can walk portions of the pedestrian tunnels on official Capitol tours, but the small subway cars themselves, along with the newer automated links to the Hart and Dirksen buildings installed since the September 11th attacks, remain restricted to members of Congress, their staff, and credentialed press chasing down a quote between votes. The system hasn't been entirely accident-free either. A 2007 collision on the Rayburn to Capitol line sent an operator to the hospital after a car failed to slow down at the end of its track. A reminder that even a century-old people mover built for convenience still comes with the same basic risks as any other rail system, just tucked far enough underground that most Americans have no idea it exists at all. Number 7. Subtropolis, Kansas City, Missouri. Marketed, quite literally, with a trademarked slogan as the world's largest underground business complex, Subtropolis sits roughly 150 feet beneath the bluffs north of the Missouri River, carved into a 270-million-year-old limestone deposit that miners spent decades hollowing out using the room and pillar method, leaving behind 25-foot square limestone pillars, reportedly 6 times stronger than poured concrete to hold the ceiling up while removing everything around them. Mining first began there in the 1940s to supply Kansas City's booming construction industry, long before anyone imagined turning the leftover void into office space. Kansas City Chiefs founder Lamar Hunt began redeveloping the abandoned mine into commercial space in the 1960s, and today, the complex spans millions of square feet, home to more than 50 companies and roughly 2,000 employees working in everything from automotive assembly to food distribution, all inside a space that maintains a naturally stable temperature between 65 and 72 degrees year-round, cutting utility costs dramatically compared to a comparable building on the surface. Trucks and heavy machinery move freely through corridors 40 feet wide and 16 feet high, along nearly 7 miles of illuminated paved roads that make the whole complex feel less like a mine and more like an industrial park somebody happened to build underground. Security runs around the clock too, with commissioned officers patrolling a facility that's considered, according to its own operators, one of the safest places to be during a natural disaster, thanks to limestone pillars strong enough to shrug off nearly anything the surface weather can throw at them. It's also, somewhat improbably, home to a significant chunk of Hollywood's own history. Film preservation vaults inside Subtropolis reportedly store studio prints of classics like Gone with the Wind and Ben-Hur, alongside every episode of Seinfeld, kept in climate-controlled darkness 150 feet below a city most people only associate with barbecue and jazz. Vault manager Brian Corwin has said the movie studios themselves won't even let him disclose the full extent of what's stored there, worried that too much detail might tempt thieves into targeting one of the most valuable, least advertised archives in American entertainment history. Beyond the film vaults, Subtropolis has also become home to a genuinely eclectic mix of tenants over the years, including the world's first underground paintball arena and an exotic flower garden specializing in orchids, proving that once you've got 55 million square feet of naturally climate-controlled space to fill, eventually somebody's going to use part of it for something nobody would ever expect to find under a Missouri bluff. Number 6. The Detroit Salt Mine, Michigan. Somewhere around 400 million years ago, an ancient inland sea covering what's now the Great Lakes region evaporated in cycles, leaving behind massive horizontal salt deposits that got buried under hundreds of feet of glacial drift and sediment as the Michigan basin sank lower over millions of years. Detroit residents discovered the rock salt sitting beneath their city in 1895, but reaching it turned out to be lethal work. 6 men died digging the original shaft, contending with hydrogen sulfide gas along the way, before the Detroit Salt and Manufacturing Company even finished it, and the effort bankrupted the original company before a reorganized outfit finally broke through in 1910. Today's mine sits roughly 1,200 feet below the surface and sprawls across more than 1,500 acres beneath Detroit and several surrounding suburbs, including Melvindale and parts of Allen Park, connected by over 100 miles of underground roads wide enough for the trucks that haul processed salt back up to the surface. It operated with public tours for decades during its mid-century heyday, giving generations of Michigan schoolchildren a field trip unlike almost any other in the country before safety regulations ended public access in the 1980s, replacing school buses full of curious kids with delivery trucks hauling processed salt in and out through the same entrance. The mine has changed hands several times since, most recently in 2010 when the Kistner Group purchased the operation, and it remains, by the company's own estimate, one of the safest and most modern mining operations anywhere in the world, despite its age. It remains a fully active industrial mine today, still producing rock salt used to de-ice roads across the Midwest every single winter, meaning the salt truck clearing your street in January may well have come from directly underneath the city itself, hauled up from a seabed that existed roughly 200 million years before the first dinosaurs walked the earth. For a city better known for cars, Motown, and hockey, it's a strange bit of trivia that one of Detroit's oldest and most consistently profitable industries has spent over a century operating almost entirely out of sight, more than 1,000 feet below everything else the city is actually famous for. The mine's scale is genuinely difficult to picture from the surface. Its roughly 100 miles of underground roads stretch out beneath Dearborn's Ford Rouge complex and most of Melvindale without a single visible sign at street level, meaning thousands of Detroit area residents drive to work, run errands, and raise families every single day, directly above an active industrial mine they've likely never once thought about. Number 5. Cincinnati's abandoned subway, Ohio. Few American cities have a bigger, what could have been, sitting directly beneath their streets than Cincinnati. Voters approved $6 million for a 16-mile rapid transit loop back in 1916, and construction actually broke ground in January of 1920. But World War I-era inflation, ballooning material costs, and a series of political and financial setbacks left the project permanently unfinished. By 1927, roughly 2 miles of tunnel and 4 full stations had been built, complete with platforms, staircases, and tiled walls, with Race Street planned as the system's grand central hub. And then the money simply ran out. Rather than finish the job, the city built a road, Central Parkway, directly on top of the abandoned right-of-way in 1928 and mothballed the whole project under newly elected Mayor Murray Seasongood. Since then, Cincinnati has floated an almost comic number of alternate uses for the empty tunnels over the decades. A bomb shelter, a wine cellar, a nightclub district, and, repeatedly, yet another attempt to actually finish the subway, an idea the Cincinnati Engineers Club first floated as early as 1936. None of it has ever gone anywhere, mostly because the estimated repair and completion costs keep climbing into the hundreds of millions, with even a simple annual maintenance estimate running past $2.6 million just to keep the tunnels from deteriorating further, and a full completion estimate long ago crossing the $100 million mark before anyone's even touched a shovel. Interstate 75 construction eventually demolished several of the above-ground stations that had originally been completed, including Marshall Avenue, Ludlow Avenue, and Clifton Avenue, leaving only the underground portions intact. The tunnels remain sealed today, largely inaccessible except to the fiber optic cables now running through them, and the occasional very determined urban explorer, a genuinely finished-looking transit system that has never once carried a single paying passenger in nearly a century of sitting exactly where it was left. Cincinnati's Transportation Department Director Michael Moore summed up the situation to The Verge in 2016 about as honestly as any city official ever describes their own infrastructure failure. Officials had fielded proposals for everything from grain malting to a water bottling operation to nightclubs, and none of it had ever gone anywhere either, mostly because the tunnel's uneven floors and a constantly leaking 1950s-era water main make even a modest repurposing project far more expensive than it sounds on paper. Number 4. The Portland-Shanghai Tunnels, Oregon. Beneath Portland's Old Town Chinatown neighborhood runs a network of basements and passageways that's become the centerpiece of one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring urban legends. That a labyrinth of tunnels once connected waterfront bars directly to the docks, allowing crimps to drug unsuspecting men, drop them through trapdoors, and sell them into forced labor on outbound cargo ships, a practice known as Shanghaiing, with some tellings claiming as many as 1,500 men vanished this way in a single year. The legend traces back to a 1933 series of colorful, loosely sourced newspaper articles by journalist Stuart Holbrook, which described the era's rough waterfront culture without originally mentioning any tunnels at all, and it hardened into its modern form in the 1970s when a local historian named Michael P. Jones began giving tours and telling increasingly vivid stories about the tunnel's criminal past, complete with claimed connections to opium dens and forced prostitution. There's just one problem, according to actual historians who've dug through the surviving records. While Shanghaiing itself genuinely happened in Portland between roughly 1850 and 1941, well-documented instances describe victims being marched openly through alleys and streets, not smuggled through a purpose-built underground network. As historian Barney Blaylock put it, after years spent combing through primary sources for his own 2014 book on the subject, no verified evidence has ever surfaced connecting the basements to any organized tunnel system built specifically for the trade. The basements themselves are real, and they were genuinely used to move goods between the waterfront and downtown storefronts, connected by steel doors and trapdoors that made perfectly ordinary sense for a working commercial district handling shipments off the docks. Whether they were ever the crime scene the tour guides describe is, at best, still an open question that a century of retelling has only made harder to untangle. Guided tours through sections of the old basements still run today, complete with actors, artifacts, and the occasional actor playing a boarding master, blending genuine 1870s architecture with a story that may owe more to Prohibition-era pulp fiction than to anything that actually happened along the Willamette waterfront. Number 3. Seattle Underground, Washington. At 2:20 p.m. on June 6, 1889, a pot of overheating glue in a Pioneer Square carpentry shop tipped over onto a pile of wood shavings and turpentine, and within hours, the resulting blaze had consumed roughly 25 blocks of Seattle's mostly wooden downtown. Firefighters, already short on water pressure because the entire city ran its hydrants at once, watched the fire jump straight into a hardware store stocked with liquor and ammunition. Remarkably, nobody died. But the fire gave city planners an opening they'd wanted for years, a chance to finally fix Pioneer Square's chronic flooding problem, caused by streets built directly on soggy, low-lying tide flats, where, according to local lore, the mud occasionally swallowed small dogs whole. Rather than simply rebuild at the old grade, the city decided to raise its streets by anywhere from 10 to 30 feet, using rubble from the fire and imported fill dirt packed behind new concrete retaining walls, under the direction of city engineer Reginald H. Thompson. For a strange transitional period lasting several years, both levels operated simultaneously, with pedestrians climbing ladders between the old sidewalks and the new elevated streets above them, occasionally falling the full story down if they missed a step in the dark. Once the regrade finished, the original ground floor storefronts were simply abandoned in place, sealed beneath the new city rather than demolished, complete with intact signage, display windows, and in some spots, entire brick facades still standing exactly as their owners left them. They sat forgotten for decades until a preservationist named Bill Speidel began offering tours in the 1960s specifically to save Pioneer Square from further demolition, inadvertently turning a drainage fix into one of the most popular tourist attractions in the entire Pacific Northwest. Only a limited, structurally reinforced portion of the underground is open to visitors today, but on a sunny day, the telltale glass prisms embedded in Pioneer Square's modern sidewalks, installed originally to let light filter down to the buried storefronts below, still glow faintly underfoot. A small, easy-to-miss signal that an entire abandoned city is sitting just beneath the pavement, waiting for anyone who happens to look down at exactly the right moment. Number 2. The Freedom Tunnel, New York City. Running roughly 2.5 miles beneath Manhattan's Riverside Park, this active Amtrak tunnel earned its nickname not from any government designation, but from a graffiti artist named Chris Freedom Pape, who began tagging its walls in 1974 and kept at it for decades, eventually covering long stretches of 30 underground blocks with large-scale reproductions of classical art, including his own black and silver take on Goya's 3rd of May and a full train car-length recreation of the hands from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. The tunnel sat closed to rail traffic for most of the 1970s and 80s, and during that stretch, it became home to a genuine underground community of homeless New Yorkers, later immortalized, with some real dispute over accuracy, in Jennifer Toth's 1993 book, The Mole People, a book NYC subway historian Joseph Brennan later criticized harshly, saying flatly that, "Every fact in this book that I can verify independently is wrong." Pape befriended many of the tunnel's actual residents during that period regardless, later saying in a 2014 interview that he'd painted there for 6 years before people even moved in, and that once they did, I became friendly with most of them, and my visits to the tunnel were much safer and even relaxing. Amtrak reactivated the tunnel for train service in 1991, evicting roughly 50 residents in the process and offering them vouchers for temporary housing, and began painting over Pape's murals in 2009 to discourage urban explorers from wandering the active tracks. Even now, faded traces of that painted-over history occasionally bleed back through, with water damage and time slowly stripping away the gray cover coat and exposing ghostly outlines of Pape's original work underneath. Trains still run through it today, carrying commuters directly past faded traces of a community and an art gallery that most passengers have absolutely no idea they're passing through, their windows briefly flickering past decades of hidden New York history at 60 miles an hour. Number 1, the storm drain tunnels beneath Las Vegas, Nevada. And here's the one that puts the biggest gap between what's happening above ground and what's happening below it. Built starting in the early 1990s to handle the flash floods that regularly threaten a city built in the middle of the Mojave Desert, the drainage system beneath Las Vegas now stretches across roughly 600 miles of concrete tunnels, running directly underneath the casinos, hotels, and neon of the Strip itself, most of them averaging only about 5 feet in height. Somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 people currently call those tunnels home, according to outreach workers who regularly travel into the system to check on residents and connect them with medical care, a number that homelessness advocates say has climbed in recent years, alongside a broader 18% national rise in homelessness. Many have built genuinely elaborate shelters out of plywood, scrap metal, and salvaged furniture just yards beneath some of the most expensive real estate in the country, choosing the tunnels specifically because they offer shelter from both extreme desert heat and law enforcement. It's also, by design, genuinely dangerous. The same tunnels built to move floodwater fast can fill without much warning during a sudden desert storm, and case managers working the tunnels describe persuading residents to come above ground, even briefly, as one of the hardest parts of the job. One resident named Natasha, who's lived intermittently in the tunnels for roughly 2 years after her boyfriend died of an overdose, described the tunnel community candidly to a reporter. "I never knew how bad the whole homeless situation was here." Case manager Brian Johnson, who regularly walks the tunnels flashlight in hand, described the network more bluntly still as a perilous grid where people hide from the world above while risking exactly the kind of flash flood the system was built to prevent for everyone else. Some residents eventually do find their way out. A couple named Eddie and Jody, both in their 50s, spent nearly a decade underground before finally moving into a pay-by-month motel room, telling one interviewer that even the chaos of the city's above-ground homeless services felt more manageable than what they'd left behind in the tunnels. Local nonprofits like the Shine a Light Foundation now make daily trips down into the drains specifically to check on residents, and a new 900-bed facility called Campus for Hope recently broke ground above ground, promising addiction recovery services and job training for anyone willing to make the climb back up into the desert sun. It's a strange kind of civic split screen that plays out every single day in Las Vegas. Tourists a few hundred feet overhead cheering at a blackjack table or watching the fountains at the Bellagio, while directly beneath their feet, an entire parallel population navigates flashlight beams, flash flood warnings, and makeshift walls built from whatever scraps happened to wash down the tunnel that week. So there they are, 10 tunnels running beneath 10 American cities, holding everything from abandoned subway platforms to an entire film archive to hundreds of people the city above has never quite figured out how to help. Some of these tunnels were built and simply outlived their purpose, left behind by streetcar systems and rerouted canals that moved on decades ago without them. A couple were never finished at all, monuments to ambitious plans that ran out of money at exactly the wrong moment. And at least one holds more actual human lives, right now, tonight, than most small towns, hidden in plain sight beneath a city built entirely around being seen. What ties all 10 together, whether they were built for commuters, senators, salt, or floodwater, is how quickly a city can forget what's directly beneath its own sidewalks once the original reason for digging stops mattering. A subway gets abandoned mid-construction, a canal gets rerouted, a mine stops paying, and within a generation or two, most residents walking overhead have no idea any of it is even down there, until a graffiti artist, a preservationist, or an outreach worker with a flashlight goes looking and finds an entire hidden layer of the city's own history still sitting exactly where it was left. Either way, the next time you're walking through a downtown that seems perfectly ordinary at street level, there's a decent chance something considerably stranger is running directly underneath your shoes. If this rundown kept you hooked, hit like, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and let us know in the comments which of these 10 tunnels surprised you the most.